Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, my name is Sarah and I make videos about health and fitness and all of those things, endurance sports. So if that's something that you're into, you can go on down there and click all of those there doodads. You know, peer pressure, everybody else is doing it. Save the whales and all of that. I hope somebody else remembers Save the Whales, because if not, I feel abundantly old right now. But anyway, today's video is about erg mode. Now I have talked about erg mode a bit here and there, and I did touch on it a bit in my Workouts 101 video, but I think this is a subject matter that really requires its own standalone video, as there are a number of folks that are coming to things like Zwift and Trainer Road as brand new to indoor cycling, people who are upgrading their equipment, or people who just may have been avoiding erg mode for a while through lack of understanding. So I want to try to help to develop an understanding of how erg mode works and when and why you might want to use erg mode. So to start, for those people who might just be coming in completely blind, erg mode is something specific to structured training. So if you are just looking to ride on Zwift or Ruvi or RGT or Veloton, when you're just looking to kind of free ride through the world or race, erg mode probably isn't going to have a whole lot of interest for you. This is only if you're looking to do structured interval training or anything like that. So you don't need to be concerned with erg mode if you're only looking to free ride or basically race. But for those of you who do want to train with a little bit more structure, understanding erg mode can be very important for you. Now, erg mode is a specific type of resistance mechanism or algorithm when it comes to using your smart trainer. So you need a smart trainer to use erg mode. It could be a wheel-on smart or a direct drive smart. And it's basically a different option than standard resistance mode. So standard resistance mode is when you basically set a resistance in your trainer. And then when you are doing a workout around that center point, that standard resistance, you're going to have to shift up or down. You're going to have to adjust your cadence and adjust your torque to match the power on the screen. So very often the way that we were training intervals wise for a very long time. So before we even had these types of programs, we had little pieces of paper on our stems or our top tubes, or we had things in our head that we knew that we had to watch the clock and we had to watch the power output that was prescribed by the workout, and then we had to do what we needed to do to match that. Resistance mode is basically doing that while applying a fixed resistance that you can adjust as the user, so it feels a little bit more true to life for you. It's really going to be depending on what feels right to you, and what you set for resistance might be different than what somebody else sets for resistance. There's no right or wrong, but that's what resistance mode is. Now, erg mode is different in that it automates that process, and what it's really intended to do is to eliminate one of those variables, being shifting. So you really only need to focus on your torque and cadence to execute the power, and then the resistance is going to adjust itself automatically to keep you on target, which can be very beneficial, especially for some of those longer interval sets where you might start to lose focus a little bit. So what's going to happen is that the trainer takes two inputs. It takes the input from the software saying, hey, I need Mr. or Mrs. Rider to give me 250 watts. And then it takes your input, which is, hi, I'm Mr. or Mrs. Rider, and I'm putting out 100 watts. And it wants to balance those two numbers. So it wants to bring you up to what the software is telling you. So in that case, if you were only going 100 watts and the software wants you to go 250, what's going to happen is that it's going to tell the trainer is going to in turn add resistance to give you physiological feedback to say, oh, I need to add more power so that I can match what it's telling me to. Think of this as almost like you are riding on the road and you start to hit an incline. What's going to happen is even before you see it, sometimes you're going to start to feel that feedback. And in order to maintain that cadence or that momentum, you realize you're going to have to add more power or more torque. And this is without even looking at the numbers on the screen. It's giving you that same physiological feedback. It's putting more resistance under the pedals. It says, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Rider, give me more. I'm adding more resistance because I want you to push harder. And that's going to help you to balance out the power. And then when it finds that equilibrium, it stops adding resistance and holds it at a steady state. And any of those little micro adjustments that you might make, whether you drop off the power, you start adding too much power, the resistance will adjust in turn to keep you balanced at that power output. So it's trying to stabilize your power output, keep you more adherent to the workout, and eliminate really the need for shifting when it comes to using erg mode. So it could be really effective. But that's basically erg mode in a nutshell. Now there's a lot more nuance to it than that, but this basic understanding will allow you to follow along with the rest of the video where I'll cover a lot of that nuance. And the way I want to address this video is I want to kind of go through some of the misapprehensions or the misinformation out there surrounding erg mode, because I think that's what trips most people up. They start to kind of intellectually actually understand what erg mode is, but then when they go out on forums or they watch some videos, they get a lot of information that's kind of laced with people's opinions, couched as declarative statements, and then they get really confused and they don't understand, and they might be making decisions about their training based on bad information. So I want to kind of demystify some of that, kind of debunk some of the myths surrounding erg mode, and hopefully it will put you in a place that you can better make a decision as to when, where, why, and maybe how you're going to use erg mode in your training. So the first myth I want to dispel here comes from the fact that erg mode is often not very well explained. And if you do a Google search and you look up erg mode, you'll see things like erg mode keeps you at the particular power or the power prescribed, right? And people start to interpret that or conflate that with the idea that erg mode or the trainer is doing some of the work for you, kind of like a pedal assist that you would find on an e-bike, but that's not actually the case. Erg mode is not doing any work for you. It's not cheating to use erg mode. All it's doing is adjusting that resistance to offset some of that shifting for you and to keep you more stable. You get zero, I repeat, zero power benefit from using erg mode. In fact, erg mode is arguably harder, not in terms of the power execution, but the fact that you are more required to stay on target, right? You're not able to really undershoot that power. You can't really take those micro rests. It keeps you very honest, right? The body is lazy, and that's not a personal shot. That's just evolutionary fact, right? The lizard brain wants to conserve energy and calories the best that it can. So if it's able to take advantage of the opportunity for respite, then it's going to take that. Even when the thinking brain says, hey, you need to do work right now, asshole, it's going to do whatever it can to take that rest. Erg mode doesn't really let you do that. It doesn't let you drop off the power for more than a few seconds before it says, no, no, I need you up here, adds in the resistance and keeps you honest. So in that regard, it could actually be harder than riding in standard mode, but it's not going to make it any easier for you. I completely blame the verbiage here. I can see why people come to this understanding if they're just kind of reading something or they hear something and they're not fully putting it into context, but you get no advantage and erg mode is not doing the work for you. It's just a different way of applying that resistance. The next argument I see on the surface seems plausible, but at the end of the day, I really think it's kind of specious. And this is the idea that because there's no erg mode out on the real road, training with it is not really practical. You're not practicing shifting, you're not practicing pacing and things that you would be required to do on the real road. But that's really missing the entire premise of structured workouts to begin with. By that logic, structured workouts aren't practical because we don't go out in a race or a group ride and ride 4 minutes at one power and 1 minute at another power and then 4 minutes at this power and then 1 minute at this power. That's not how we ride in the real road. It's not preparing us for anything. Riding on the road is highly variable. The purpose of structured workouts is to allow us to accumulate time under tension, stress at a particular power zone. It helps us to execute in terms of our efficiency and our repeatability and to build our capacity to work at different levels of power, so when we do go execute on the real road, we have more flexibility and more adaptation to do so. It's not to practice for a specific output. Now, that is not to say that we shouldn't be practicing for real world events. Quite the contrary. I 100% agree that people need to practice climbing for climbs and practice the shifting that comes with that, or if you're a time trialist, you have to be able to practice pacing without erg mode, but it's not an either or, it's a both and. You need to be able to mix and match with a well-developed training plan, the different elements that you are going to need to make you a more capable rider on the road. And structured training with erg mode can fit into that very well. So if you're using a few structured training workouts a week, and then you do a free ride or a race on a weekend to help you to kind of practice that variability and that execution that you might find on the real road, that's going to give you a really well-rounded training plan. So I really don't buy into this idea that, well, you need to practice shifting and power execution exactly like it is on the real road. I really do think that that's hogwash. That completely eliminates the purpose of structured training. Then we shouldn't do anything. We should just ride the same roads all the time, right? So I would just completely dispel that idea. I think that's really an old school, rigid thought process, and I don't really think it serves people very well to give them the idea that if they need to train or want to train structured workouts with erg mode, that somehow they're cheating themselves or they're not really getting the full benefit. That couldn't be further from the truth. That's just my 2 cents on that. I would ignore that type of thought process. I don't think it's effective. And again, there's no science to support that using erg mode is any less effective than using just standard resistance mode. And the last thing I want to talk about is kind of the biggest objection or contention that I see out there when it comes to erg mode. And it's a multivariate problem, and it comes with the way that it feels. People don't think that it feels right. It doesn't feel similar to the real road. A lot of times you'll hear people say this about power levels in excess of zone 3 or highly variable working sets where you have, low state recoveries and high states of working sets, and that those transitions don't feel natural. And that really comes from one of 3 different elements. And the first one is equipment. There's limitations for equipment. I'll talk about that in a moment. The second thing is user error or user inexperience. Again, I'll talk about that. And then the third thing comes from some of the limitations of the technology, and not specifically to erg mode per se, but more specifically to the wireless protocols that we use to communicate back and forth with our trainers that could cause some issues for that. So I'm going to talk about all 3 of those things to kind of put some of those into perspective. So the first thing I want to talk about is equipment. And the most trouble people have in terms of erg mode usually comes from those wheel-on trainers. And it's really just a limitation of the technology. It's really born of the fact that the flywheel is really small. There's a lot of variability when it comes to tire pressures, the material of which the tire is built, comes from how much clamp force you can get, what type of resistance you have. Is it a fluid unit? Is it a mag unit? There's a lot of different variables when it comes to the smart trainers when they are wheel-on trainers. And while you can dial that in a little bit and the technology has gotten better over time, people still struggle a little bit, especially when they get to those higher zones of power over zone 3. Things start to feel maybe a little bit muddy or mushy for them. And that is a real problem. It does come up for people. I'm not going to say that that's not a real thing. People do struggle with that. And what I will say to that effect is that if you're using erg mode and it's detracting from the quality of your workouts, ditch it. You shouldn't be using anything that's going to take away from the quality or the efficacy of your workouts. And that's going to be contingent on you and your equipment. My recommendation is that as your equipment starts to wear down and it's time for a replacement, I would highly recommend looking at a direct drive trainer, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of structured training over the course of the year. The experience and the efficacy is just well worth its weight in gold, and I would highly recommend it. And with the trickle-down technology being what it is, it's making these direct drive trainers a lot cheaper with time. I think that they're going to completely supplant the wheel-on trainer. Those are going to probably see obsolescence in the next 5 years because you'll be able to get a direct drive trainer for the same price that you can currently get a wheel-on trainer. But just keep that in mind. Maybe if you can budget for that down the line, it'll make erg mode a lot more effective for you. In terms of direct drive trainers, it really keeps that level as long as you're using it properly. And I will talk about that in the user error and inexperience section. But when it comes to using the direct drive trainer, it really should feel pretty true to life at all the different power zones. The exception being is that some of the older direct drive trainers have what's called a power floor. Not all the models, but some of them would struggle below 100 watts in terms of keeping a steady resistance. So when people would go into, for a lot of folks, their recovery zones under 100 watts, things would get a little bit jerky or uneven. In the last 4 years, they've really done a lot to correct that. To my knowledge, all of the newer model trainers, I'm not familiar with all of them, but all of them that I know of, the mainstream names, they've all kind of corrected for that, so that's really not a problem anymore. But if you do have a model that has that issue, one of the workarounds is to sometimes turn up the workout bias maybe during those recoveries, or turn off erg mode during those recoveries to offset that limitation. But for anything zone 2 and up, or anything over 100 watts, it's usually going to be a pretty good experience for you. If it's not a good experience for you, that would lead us into the second piece, which is user error or user inexperience. And this isn't to make fun of anybody or to judge anybody harshly. Erg mode is not something that's super intuitive. So there are some mistakes or some issues that can come up through lack of experience as a user of erg mode that I'm hopefully going to be able to provide you with some information to offset. So the first thing you need to bear in mind when you're using erg mode is selecting the proper gearing. Now I said that it eliminates the need for shifting, but gearing is exceptionally important. And by gearing, I mean the gear that you select to start your workout with. You can start a workout in any gear, and erg mode will let you do that. But because erg mode does not set a fixed resistance for different powers, it is not going to know that you're kind of in a dumb gear. So what do I mean by that? If you are at 100 watts and it wants 150 watts, all it's going to do is add the brake until you hit 150 watts. It doesn't say 150 watts equals this amount of resistance. It literally is just going to gradually add in resistance until it gets a match, and then it's going to stop, which means you can be at any gear and it's going to continue to follow that model. But the limitation is the flywheel speed. So when your flywheel speed is not commensurate with good inertia feel, it's going to feel kind of funny. So let's use the granny gear as an example. If you start a workout in your granny gear, so let's say you're in a compact crankset and you're in the 34 in the front and you're in the 28 or even the 32 in the rear, you can go ahead and apply that power, and what's going to happen is that flywheel is going to move really slow, kind of like on the road, right? You can ride really easy and you're going to just go slow. That's kind of the concept of gearing, right? It's the transfer of power. It's still going to keep you moving, but you're not going to be able to go all that fast. And it's fine until it's not. So what's going to happen is that flywheel is going to be moving slow, which isn't going to be an issue at that lower level of power. But as the workout is going to call for you to raise your level of power, now it's going to elicit an increase in braking resistance, right? So it's going to add that brake to a flywheel that's already going slow, which is going to in turn slow the flywheel down more. So as you're applying a greater amount of power, what's going to happen is you're going to get that kind of herky-jerky, riding through mud or sand kind of feeling, almost like you're revving an engine with a dead battery, that kind of speed up, slow down feeling, and it can be really uncomfortable and really jerky. You don't want to be riding like that, right? You're just never going to get out of that if you're in too easy of a gear. On the flip side, if you're in too heavy or too hard of a gear, you're going to get the opposite effect, right? So you're going to start pedaling, and let's say you're in your 5311, right? And you're pedaling really easy, but that flywheel is going to start spinning really fast. That's how gearing works. That's how pulley systems work, right? You're getting more work done at one point for less work at a different point because you're getting the assistance of that gearing. And then what's going to happen is that the flywheel is going to start moving so fast that the cassette can't possibly grab it anymore. So it's going to be very similar to when you run out of gears, when you're riding fast on a downhill. Eventually, you're just going to run out of gears. And what's going to happen when you're in that very hard gear is that flywheel is going to simulate the same thing that you would find on the real road. And it's going to spin so fast that the cassette can't possibly catch it. And then you're going to be flailing around and you're going to have to wait for that flywheel to slow down. You're going to have to add gears, but wait, you can't because you're already in the hardest gear. So that's going to give you some issues. Now, most people aren't riding at those extremes, but if you're closer to the tails of those extremes, you might start to see that your experience falters a little bit. So just the experience of understanding that you need to be in the right gearing. A nice straight chain line is really the best that you can possibly use. So if you're in standard gearing, you use your big ring, something somewhere in the middle of the cassette. You can kind of play around with that. And if you're using a 1x system, same thing, just use something in the middle of the cassette. You can kind of play around and dial that in. But as long as you're kind of in the middle, you're going to get a good inertia feel that's going to be pretty similar to what you would feel on the real road. The other piece of this comes from transitions. So people will say something to the effect, well, if you're going from 100 watts to 400 watts, that transition's not going to feel natural. Of course it's not. But that's because of the way that the workout is structured, not because of erg mode. Certainly, if you just sit there and you pedal at 100 watts and then you just wait for the resistance to kick all the way in before you start adding in power at 400 watts, yeah, it's going to feel like junk. It's not going to feel very good for you. It's not going to feel natural at all. But the reality is you have to manage those transitions. You would have to do that if you were riding to resistance mode as well. So what people really should be doing is transitioning kind of before the interval. You have to kind of pay attention and work in advance. So if you see that that's coming up, usually 1 to 2 seconds beforehand, you start adding or subtracting, if you're going down, your power level so that you can start to match what's going on. Now, some of the programs like Trainer Road and Ruby have already built that into their braking mechanism and their algorithm to start doing that for you, to remind you to start doing that. Things like Zwift have not done that yet, but you can still take care of that on your own when it comes to Zwift. And you can start the 2 seconds beforehand and start adding in or subtracting out that power. And because it's only about 2 seconds, that does not give erg mode enough time to really absorb that as a drop or a rise in power that it needs to react to. So it's not going to react to that. And then when the interval changes, you're already kind of halfway there. You have to come the rest of the way as the brake engages, and then you're up to speed. And you're not really cheating yourself out of the interval. You're just taking everything and kind of shifting it a second or two backwards. So it's going to be a lot more effective if you manage transitions like you would in resistance mode instead of relying on the trainer to do everything for you. You do have to kind of work with the system in a way that makes sense. So I really think that that objection really falls apart rather quickly when you try to compare it to using resistance mode. You have to manage those transitions. Now, this is a good point to talk about what you might hear termed as the spiral of death. This is a real thing. This is something that was really pervasive in ERG mode and still exists on some platforms, and other platforms have done a little bit in their algorithms to help that. But what the spiral of death is what happens when the system starts to read a drop in power and then adds resistance, and then you end up in this vicious cycle. So that is to say, let's say you were riding at 250 watts and you get a little bit distracted and you drop down to 220 watts for 3 seconds. Well, then it's going to add resistance because it wants you back at 250 watts. But maybe you've gotten caught out to the point where your cadence is too low and you really can't execute that high level of power at that lower cadence. It's just not within your capability. So you're going to fail to meet that power level. So what the trainer's going to do is add more resistance because it's still trying to bring you up, and you can see how the cycle continues until you come to a dead stop. Now, platforms like Trainer Road and Ruvi have done a little bit of work so that you can start to pick up your cadence a little bit, and it reads that change and it lets off the brake to allow you to get back in control of the cadence without really penalizing you and putting you in the death spiral. But not all platforms have done that. And for those of you on Zwift, it has not made a repair to that portion of the algorithm. So what's going to happen is you either have to put in a huge spike of power to overcome it and basically tell the trainer, oh crap, you're at 290 watts, let go of the brake, or you're going to have to shift gears, and that might not always be the best move. So what I usually recommend people do to offset that is to have the companion app handy or have your keyboard handy. Just click off your ERG mode temporarily, get back in control of your cadence. You're not really going to lose much by way of power. You just kind of get back in control, and then when you turn ERG mode back on, it's basically going to stay consistent with where you are if you're on the power target. So it's not going to be penalizing you with more resistance anymore. It's just the best we can do with what we have, and it's a good workaround. But again, it's an inexperience thing. If you're just not experienced enough to know how to offset that, or if you haven't experienced the death spiral before, you might not realize that that's what you're in for. Now, there is a pretty substantial limitation in ERG mode when it comes to very high levels of power or when it comes to very short intervals. Now, the high levels of power really come from the fact that the platforms are not really able to understand what your sprint is. So you're building a lot of these structured workouts based on a percentage of your FTP. People's sprints are so inconsistent, or their max level power is so inconsistent from rider to rider, it can't possibly guess who is who or what is what. So one person that has an FTP of 400 watts might have a 1600 watt sprint, and one person with an FTP of 400 watts might only have an 800 watt sprint, right? So they could both be very strong riders, but one of them sprints far better than the other one. And there's no way that these platforms would really know the difference. So it does not know how much power to apply for the resistance, and it can either undershoot you or overshoot you. So in terms of sprint level workouts, you're just not going to want to use ERG mode at all for that reason. But there is another concern when it comes to the wireless protocols that we use via ANT+ or Bluetooth. And the communication between those, even in a good system, is not the best. We're talking about a couple of seconds. So now we've got the transition time, which takes maybe a second or two. And then we have the transmission of those signals between the platform and the trainer, which also takes a couple of seconds and could potentially be interrupted. And when you're talking about shorter intervals, it really makes it tough. So what you might find is a 10-second interval. By the time that you adjust into the right power, the interval's already over and you've shortchanged yourself. Usually anything under 15 seconds is subject to this. And if you have one of the entry level to mid-range direct drive trainers, or if you have an older one, sometimes it's anything under 30 seconds. But 15 seconds seems to be a pretty good rule of thumb for a lot of the modern trainers. And anything below that, it just really struggles with those transitions and that transmission speed electronically. Now, I've been able to do, actually recently I did a workout which was 15-second microbursts, which is 15 seconds at zone 6 and then 15 seconds at zone 1 and back and forth. And I was able to manage that pretty well by using that 2 seconds before to manage those transitions. So I took everything and shifted it 2 seconds back so that I was on top of that gearing, and then I was able to maximize on the entire length of the interval. But what happens to people a lot of times is sometimes because those signals are coming back and forth too quickly, that one of them gets missed. That ANT+ or Bluetooth just does not transmit that signal, and you could completely miss an entire interval, or it engages late and it either shortchanges your working set or your recovery, which can be really frustrating, especially when you're working a hard workout. So the more of those intervals you have and the closer together that they are, the less stable it becomes because of this limitation. You just have to kind of learn how to manage it. But until we get these hardwired trainers, you're still going to have this as an issue. And even when we do have hardwired trainers, I don't think that anything under 10 seconds is really going to be that great, because again, you still have to deal with that transition time. The brake still needs to apply. And if it was going to apply instantaneously, it's probably going to break. So just something to bear in mind there. It's just a limitation of the technology, not endemic to ERG mode specifically, but just the communication protocols and the technology limitations that we have at the moment. But the bottom line here is that ERG mode is a very effective tool to add to your training tool belt. Anybody who is training with purpose and intention, with a well-rounded training plan, and using the right tools at the right time can't possibly lodge a legitimate criticism, at least towards the efficacy of ERG mode. Now, if you don't like ERG mode, or if it just doesn't suit your needs, that's completely fair. To each their own. I'm not sitting here telling everybody that they have to use ERG mode or trying to sell it to you. The purpose of this video is to dispel some of these myths so that you can go into the decision making with the proper information and armed with that information so that you know what's the right fit for you, when and why you should be using ERG mode so that you can enhance your training experience. But if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to leave them down below. I'll do my best to help you guys out down there. Hit that like button if you got any value out of this video. It helps out the video and the channel quite a bit. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll put 2 more training videos up here for you guys. And as always, I will catch you in the next one. See ya.